Don't drink that coffee, sir. The words cut through the marble and chandelier silence of the Manhattan Gala like a sudden crack of thunder, and for a fraction of a second, everything in the grand Sterling ballroom seemed to forget how to move. Crystal glasses paused midair, conversations collapsed into half-formed breaths, and every head turned toward the small figure standing near the edge of the polished dance floor. Ava Johnson, an 8-year-old black girl with neatly braided hair and a simple navy dress slightly too large for her frame, stood frozen but unshaken, her eyes locked on the steaming cup in Ethan Caldwell's hand. Ethan, a 45-year-old billionaire known across New York for building Caldwell Dynamics into a global empire, had been seconds away from taking a sip, his attention previously divided between polite investor conversation and the soft music drifting through the hall. Now his hands stopped mid-motion, the porcelain cup hovering just below his lips as he slowly turned toward her voice. A faint ripple of laughter began somewhere in the crowd, uncertain and nervous, as if the room was trying to decide whether this was a mistake or a performance. At the far end of the room, Victoria Blake, Ethan's fiancée and the evening's co-host, offered a smooth, practiced smile that did not reach her eyes as she stepped forward slightly, her diamond bracelet catching the light. "That's enough, sweetheart," she said gently, her tone carefully wrapped in amusement, as though speaking to a child lost in imagination rather than urgency. "You're confused. This is a very important evening." But Ava did not move, did not lower her gaze, did not retreat into silence the way most would expect a child to under such pressure. Instead, she took one small step forward, her shoes barely making a sound against the marble, and repeated in a quieter but sharper voice, "Don't drink it." The air in the room shifted again, heavier this time, as curiosity replaced laughter. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in the careful calculation of a man who had learned to trust patterns, data, and instinct over impulse. He slowly lowered the cup to a nearby table, his movements controlled but deliberate, as a few murmurs spread among the guests seated at round tables draped in white linen. Somewhere behind him, a flash from a photographer froze the moment, capturing a billionaire, a child, and a cup of coffee suspended in tension. Victoria moved closer now, her heels clicking softly as she reached Ethan's side, placing a light hand on his arm. "Ethan, this is ridiculous," she said under her breath, her smile still intact for the audience watching. "We have investors here. Let's not entertain distractions." But Ava's voice broke through again, steadier now, as if she had already accepted that no one would immediately believe her. "I saw who brought it," she said, her small hands clenched only slightly at her sides. "I saw what was done before it came to your table." The words did not accuse, but they unsettled. Ethan studied her face, searching for exaggeration, performance, anything that would categorize this moment as harmless misunderstanding. Instead, he saw something that did not fit into the room around her, certainty. Not fear, not panic, but the calm focus of someone who had already seen something she could not unsee. A low hum spread through the guests again, this time not laughter but speculation, as phones subtly shifted in hands and conversations stopped altogether. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting briefly to Victoria before returning to Ava. "What exactly are you saying you saw?" he asked, his voice low enough that only those nearest could hear. Ava hesitated for the first time, but only for a breath, as if choosing her words carefully rather than retreating from them. "Not what was added," she said quietly. "What was switched?" The phrase landed heavily in the space between them, and for a brief moment, even the music from the string quartet seemed distant. Victoria's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, her fingers adjusting the bracelet on her wrist as she let out a soft laugh that sounded rehearsed. "Ethan," she said gently, "are we really doing this? Listening to a child's story about coffee at a gala?" But Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked down at the cup again, then back at Ava, noticing for the first time the way she was not looking at the crowd, not looking for attention, but watching him specifically, as if the entire reason she was here depended on whether he believed her or not. And in that quiet tension, beneath the crystal lights and polite society smiles, something fragile began to form. The beginning of doubt, the beginning of truth, and the first crack in a night that no one in that room would forget. Ava did not move as the silence inside the grand Sterling ballroom thickened into something almost physical, pressing against every polished surface and every carefully trained expression in the room. Ethan Caldwell stood still, his hand now resting near the untouched cup of coffee, his eyes fixed on the small girl, as if recalibrating everything he thought he understood about the evening. Around them, the guests remained frozen in polite uncertainty, the kind of silence that only appears when people are waiting for someone important to decide what reality is supposed to be. Victoria Blake let out a soft, controlled laugh, the kind designed to dissolve tension without acknowledging its cause, and gently stepped between Ethan and Ava by half a step, her voice lowering into something almost soothing. "Sweetheart," she said again, slower this time. "This is not the place for imagination. You are upsetting the guests." But Ava's gaze did not shift, not even for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried a steadiness that did not belong to fear or confusion. "I am not imagining it," she said simply. Ethan's attention sharpened at that, his instincts catching on something beneath the surface of her words, something that did not sound rehearsed or emotional, but observed. He glanced briefly at Victoria, then back at Ava. "Then tell me exactly what you saw," he said, his tone quieter now, stripped of the formality he used in boardrooms. Ava hesitated just long enough for the room to lean forward emotionally. Then she pointed not at the cup itself, but toward the serving table behind it. "The drink was not poured from the bottle that was brought in with your name on it," she said. A few guests exchanged confused looks, and one of the servers shifted uncomfortably near the catering station, suddenly aware of being noticed. Victoria's expression remained composed, but her fingers tightened slightly at her side as she responded with a soft, dismissive tone. "That is not possible. Everything here is handled by professionals." Ethan raised one hand slightly, signaling silence without looking away from Ava. "Go on," he said. Ava took a small breath, steadying herself as though recalling something precise rather than emotional. "I saw the tray get switched near the service corridor," she said. "One of the bottles was replaced before it reached your table. The labels looked the same, but they were not." A subtle shift moved through the staff near the edges of the room, barely noticeable, but present enough to change the temperature of the moment. Ethan's gaze drifted again, this time toward the catering area, where stainless steel carts stood aligned beneath soft lighting. His mind began doing what it always did when faced with uncertainty, breaking down sequences, timing, and access points. Victoria stepped closer again, this time placing more pressure in her voice, though still careful not to raise it. "Ethan, this is absurd. You are letting a child disrupt an entire evening over something she thinks she saw." But Ava did not retreat. Instead, she added one more detail, quieter but sharper than before. "There is a small red mark on the bottom of the bottle that was not supposed to be there," she said. That detail changed something. Ethan did not react outwardly, but his eyes narrowed slightly as he turned his head toward the serving staff. A waiter near the table stiffened almost imperceptibly, his hand hovering for a fraction of a second too long near the tray he had been managing earlier. The orchestra in the background continued playing, unaware of the tension now reshaping the room, but even their music seemed distant, like it belonged to a different moment entirely. Ethan finally set the cup down fully, not abruptly but with deliberate care, as though deciding that nothing about it should be assumed safe until confirmed. He turned slightly toward one of his security staff positioned near the entrance and gave a subtle nod. "Bring me the service log," he said calmly. Victoria's composure finally began to fracture at the edges, though she quickly adjusted, offering a soft laugh that sounded thinner than before. "You are really doing this because of a child's observation?" she asked. Ethan did not answer her immediately. Instead, he looked at Ava again, and for the first time since the evening began, his expression was no longer skeptical or analytical, but attentive in a way that suggested he was no longer dismissing anything. "If what you are saying is true," he said slowly, "then someone here altered something meant for me." Ava nodded once, as if confirming something obvious. The security officer returned within moments, a tablet in hand, and quietly leaned in to show Ethan the recorded service route. As Ethan studied it, the room seemed to hold its breath again, the guests sensing a shift they could not yet name. Victoria remained still, but her gaze no longer rested on Ethan or Ava, instead drifting toward the exit for just a second too long. And in that moment, the calm illusion of the evening began to fracture further, not through noise or confrontation, but through the quiet unfolding of details that no one had expected a child to notice, let alone reveal. The service corridor behind the grand Sterling ballroom was never meant to be part of the evening's memory, yet that was exactly where Ethan Caldwell found himself standing minutes later, watching the quiet machinery of luxury hospitality reveal its hidden rhythm. The tablet in his hand displayed the catering log in precise timestamps, showing every movement of trays, bottles, and assigned staff. Ava Johnson stood a few feet behind him now, her small hands folded in front of her, no longer speaking but watching the same data with a focus that seemed far older than her age. Around them, two security officers maintained a respectful distance, while the sound of the gala continued faintly through the thick doors, like a world refusing to stop existing. Victoria Blake arrived moments later, her heels echoing softly against the corridor floor, her expression carefully composed as she glanced at the screen Ethan was holding. "This is unnecessary," she said immediately, her tone controlled but firmer than before. "You are letting a misunderstanding escalate into something embarrassing." Ethan did not respond right away. Instead, he replayed the log again, his eyes tracking a specific 10-minute window where a substitution occurred. A tray marked for table 7 had been signed off twice, once by an authorized server and once by a different name that did not belong to the original schedule. He zoomed in, then paused. Ava stepped forward slightly, pointing at the screen without hesitation. "That is the moment," she said quietly. "Right there." One of the security officers leaned closer, confirming the inconsistency, and the air in the corridor shifted again, becoming more focused, more precise, as if the evening had narrowed itself into a single unresolved point. Victoria exhaled softly, a sound that tried to resemble patience. "Even if there was a clerical error," she said, "that does not mean anything harmful happened. You are building a conclusion out of coincidence." But Ethan's attention was no longer fully on her. He was now watching a secondary log feed that showed access to the service corridor door. A single entry had no matching exit record. That detail was not dramatic, not loud, but it was enough to make the situation feel less like confusion and more like interference. He turned slightly toward one of the security officers. "Who signed in under the name Hartwell at 1847? He asked. The officer hesitated before responding, scrolling through the verification list. "That name does not match any assigned staff for tonight," he said. A silence followed, heavier than the noise of the ballroom. Ava's gaze lifted slightly toward Ethan, not seeking validation but confirming that he was now seeing what she had seen. Victoria stepped forward again, her voice tightening just a fraction. "Ethan, this is becoming ridiculous. A child misreads something, and now you are interrogating your own staff." But Ethan did not look at her this time. Instead, he turned toward the corridor camera feed displayed on the tablet. The footage showed a brief moment near the service entrance where a catering cart paused longer than necessary, partially blocked from view by a passing staff member. The angle was imperfect, but the timing aligned with Ava's earlier description. He leaned slightly closer to the screen, his expression no longer skeptical but deeply focused. "Enhance that frame," he instructed quietly. One of the technicians attached to security complied immediately, and the image sharpened just enough to reveal a detail that had previously been hidden in motion. A hand reaching toward the cart, adjusting something small and deliberate before stepping away. There was no dramatic revelation in the gesture itself, only intention. Ethan stepped back slightly, absorbing the sequence rather than reacting to it. Ava remained still, her attention steady, as if she had been waiting for the exact moment when observation would become confirmation. Victoria's composure began to show its first real fracture, not in words but in stillness, as she no longer attempted to interrupt the process unfolding in front of her. Instead, she watched the screen, then the corridor, then Ethan, as if recalculating her position within the room. Ethan finally spoke again, his voice calm but no longer uncertain. "I want every staff member who handled Table 7's service route brought here," he said. The instruction was not loud, but it carried weight. One of the security officers immediately moved to comply. Ava exhaled softly, almost imperceptibly, her small shoulders easing just slightly, though her eyes remained alert. The corridor lights hummed faintly above them, and the distant sound of the gala continued unchanged, unaware that something within its structure was beginning to unravel. Ethan lowered the tablet, his gaze now fixed not on data, but on people, on timing, on presence. Someone altered the chain of custody, he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Victoria finally spoke again, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. Ethan, whatever you think you are finding here, you need to consider the consequences of false assumptions. He turned toward her slowly, studying her face not with emotion, but with the same analytical focus he had used moments earlier on the service log. And for the first time since the evening began, the balance of control in the corridor did not belong to the polished smiles or carefully constructed narratives, but to the quiet accumulation of details that refused to disappear under explanation. The service corridor outside the grand Sterling ballroom had grown quieter, but the tension inside it had only deepened, as if the silence itself had become heavier with every new confirmation the system revealed. Ethan Caldwell stood with his attention fixed on the security team as they gathered additional staff records, each name and timestamp now treated like a piece of a larger structure that was slowly exposing its weaknesses. Ava Johnson remained close to him, her posture still small but steady, her eyes moving between faces and screens with quiet focus, as if she understood that truth rarely appeared all at once but unfolded in layers. Victoria Blake stood slightly apart now, her composure still intact on the surface, but the controlled rhythm of her breathing had changed, subtle enough that only someone paying close attention would notice. The corridor lights hummed above them, casting a neutral glow that contrasted sharply with the emotional shift happening beneath it. One of the security officers returned with a second report, placing it on the tablet screen Ethan was holding. "We identified the access discrepancy," he said carefully. The service corridor entry under the name Hartwell was manually inserted into the system. It does not match any biometric or employee record. A brief silence followed, and that silence carried more weight than any immediate reaction could have. Ethan absorbed the information without speaking, his eyes narrowing slightly as he processed the implications. Ava stepped forward again, her voice calm but certain. "That is how they got the tray through without being noticed," she said. No one corrected her, because no one could immediately refute what the logs were now showing. Victoria finally broke her silence, her tone sharper than before, though still controlled for the sake of the surrounding staff. "You are all treating system errors as intentional actions," she said. "That is not how high-level security protocols work." Ethan turned toward her slowly, not with anger, but with a measured attention that made her words feel less stable than she intended. "Then explain the duplication of authorization," he said quietly. The question was simple, but it removed the space for dismissal. For the first time, Victoria did not respond immediately. Instead, she adjusted her posture slightly, her gaze shifting briefly toward the corridor exit before returning to Ethan. Ava noticed the movement, though she said nothing, her attention remaining steady. A second security officer arrived with additional footage, this time showing a clearer sequence of the service handoff near the catering area. The video displayed a brief exchange between two staff members, one of whom was not listed on the official roster. The interaction itself was brief, but its presence in the record changed the atmosphere entirely. Ethan replayed the segment twice without speaking, his expression tightening not in emotion, but in recognition of pattern. "This was coordinated," he said finally, more to himself than anyone else. Victoria exhaled slowly, her voice softening in an attempt to regain control of the narrative. "Ethan, you are interpreting fragmented data under pressure," she said. "This evening is important for your company, for your investors. You cannot allow speculation to disrupt that." But the word speculation no longer held weight in the corridor. The data was no longer abstract, and Ava's presence beside him made it harder for Ethan to dismiss what he had initially categorized as coincidence. He looked at her briefly, then back at the screen. "What made you look at the service corridor in the first place?" he asked. Ava hesitated only slightly before answering. "Because the tray did not move the way it was supposed to," she said. "It stopped for too long in a place where it should not have stopped." The simplicity of her answer carried more impact than any technical explanation, because it aligned observation with logic rather than emotion. One of the staff members nearby lowered his gaze, realizing how many small details had gone unnoticed by trained eyes. Ethan straightened slightly, his attention now fully aligned with the unfolding sequence rather than the social structure of the evening. Pull every internal access log for the past 48 hours, he instructed. I want all deviations flagged. The security team moved immediately. Victoria remained still, but her expression had shifted into something more restrained, less certain than before. Ava looked up at Ethan, not with expectation, but with quiet confirmation, as if the environment around them had finally begun to match what she had already understood. The corridor felt narrower now, not physically, but in focus, as attention condensed into a single point of unresolved truth. And in that narrowing space, the evening that had begun as a formal celebration had transformed into something far more precise, where every detail now carried consequences that no one in the room could afford to ignore. The service corridor had shifted from a place of investigation into a place of quiet movement, as security personnel began coordinating across multiple floors of the grand Sterling Ballroom to trace every access point connected to the catering system. Ethan Caldwell stood near the central terminal screen, his focus no longer scattered between guests, conversation, or the ongoing gala above, but narrowed entirely into the structured flow of data appearing in front of him. Ava Johnson remained beside him, her small figure steady, watching the screen with a calm attention that contrasted sharply with the urgency now surrounding the staff. Victoria Blake was still present, positioned slightly behind Ethan's right shoulder, her posture composed but increasingly rigid, as if she was maintaining control through stillness rather than action. The corridor lighting remained unchanged, yet the atmosphere felt different, as if the space itself had adjusted to the seriousness of what was unfolding. A senior security analyst stepped forward with a new update, holding a tablet that displayed a consolidated timeline of all service movements. We have reconstructed the full sequence for Table 7, he said. There are two overlapping entries that should not exist in parallel. One indicates standard delivery protocol. The other shows an unverified reroute through the secondary corridor. Ethan studied the display without interruption, his eyes tracing the divergence point where the system split into two conflicting paths. Ava leaned slightly closer, pointing to the moment where the route changed direction. That is where it happened, she said quietly. That is when it stopped being normal. No one questioned her interpretation anymore, because the data now aligned too precisely with her earlier observation. Victoria finally spoke, her voice measured but carrying a subtle edge. Even if there was a deviation in routing, it does not imply intent, she said. Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he zoomed into the secondary corridor feed again, watching a brief gap where the camera view shifted due to a passing maintenance cart. In that gap, a single figure appeared momentarily, interacting with the service tray before it continued forward. The action itself was small, almost invisible if not examined frame by frame, but its timing aligned exactly with the unauthorized log entry. Ethan exhaled slowly, then turned slightly toward the security team. Cross-reference that individual with all internal contractors on site, he instructed. The analysts began working immediately, the sound of typing and system updates filling the corridor in place of conversation. Ava remained still, her attention not on the screens anymore, but on Ethan, as if waiting to see whether observation would finally translate into decision. Victoria adjusted her stance again, her gaze now fixed on the far end of the corridor, where the emergency exit remained closed and unremarked upon by most of the staff. One of the analysts paused suddenly, then spoke with caution. We have a partial match, he said. The individual is not officially registered as catering staff. They were added under temporary event support with restricted clearance, but the authorization chain shows manual override at executive level. The words landed heavily in the space, changing the nature of the investigation. From procedural error to structural breach. Ethan turned his head slightly at that, his expression tightening as he absorbed the implication. Executive-level override requires direct approval, he said quietly. No one answered immediately. The silence that followed was no longer passive, but investigative. Ava looked down briefly at her hands, then back at the screen, as if confirming that what she had seen in motion now existed in record. Victoria finally broke her silence, her tone softer but more deliberate. Ethan, you are interpreting incomplete system data under emotional influence from a child's presence, she said. But her words no longer carried the same authority they had earlier. Ethan turned fully toward her for the first time in several minutes, his gaze steady but unreadable. The system is not incomplete, he said. It is consistent. What is inconsistent is the authorization layer. A subtle shift moved through the corridor as security personnel stopped moving for a brief moment, recognizing the weight of that statement. Ava stepped slightly closer to Ethan, not speaking, but no longer needing to. The data had begun speaking for itself. At that moment, another alert appeared on the central screen, indicating a final cross-reference between catering movement and financial authorization logs. The room quieted further as the system compiled the result. Ethan did not touch anything. He simply waited, watching the confirmation load. And in that suspended moment, where every movement had paused and every explanation had reached its limit, the evening crossed into a new phase where observation was no longer enough, and every remaining answer would require accountability beyond data alone. The final verification screen loaded across the central terminal in the service corridor with a slow, deliberate clarity, as if the system itself was refusing to rush the moment that would define everything that had been building up to this point. Ethan Caldwell stood motionless in front of the display, his eyes fixed on the financial authorization map, now fully expanded across multiple linked transactions, each one connecting catering access, executive permissions, and internal routing adjustments into a single traceable sequence. Ava Johnson remained beside him, her presence quiet but unwavering, her gaze moving across the highlighted connections as though she could already sense the shape of what was about to be revealed. The corridor behind them felt unusually still, not from emptiness, but from anticipation, as if every security officer, staff member, and observer understood that the next update would change the direction of the entire evening. Victoria Blake stood slightly apart now, no longer attempting to intervene verbally, her expression controlled but increasingly distant, her eyes occasionally shifting toward the screen with a precision that no longer matched casual interest. The system completed its analysis and locked onto a final correlation point, then displayed the financial authorization link that tied the catering deviation to an executive approval signature. Ethan's focus narrowed immediately as he read the identifier attached to the override. There was a pause, longer than any before it, as if even the system was allowing space for comprehension. A security analyst behind him spoke carefully, his voice lowered as though acknowledging the weight of what he was confirming. The override originates from internal executive access tied to the evening's event coordination chain, he said. It is linked to a restricted account associated with board-level authority. Ethan did not move at first. His eyes remained fixed on the signature line, as if verifying it through repetition could change its meaning. Ava stepped slightly closer, not touching the screen, but pointing at the identifier that matched the financial authorization. "That is the same one," she said softly. "That is the one I saw change earlier." The simplicity of her statement contrasted with the complexity of what the system was now revealing. Victoria finally stepped forward again, but this time her voice carried a controlled sharpness that was no longer aimed at dismissal, but at containment. "Ethan, you are aware that executive authorization systems can be misrepresented through delegation layers," she said. "This does not automatically confirm intent or responsibility." Ethan slowly turned his head toward her, studying her face with a level of attention that no longer carried the familiarity of trust, but the precision of evaluation. "It confirms access," he said quietly, "and access requires proximity." The corridor seemed to tighten around that statement, as if the space itself had adjusted to the implication. One of the senior analysts hesitated before speaking again. "We also traced physical proximity logs," he said. "The access point corresponds with someone present in the immediate service zone during the time of the routing change." The information landed without dramatic emphasis, but its effect was immediate. Ethan's attention shifted back to the screen as the system highlighted a narrow window of overlapping presence between the authorization signature and the service corridor movement. Ava remained still, her eyes following the highlighted path, as if the final piece of the pattern had aligned with what she had instinctively understood from the beginning. Victoria's posture changed slightly, not in movement, but in stillness, as though she was recalibrating her position within the unfolding structure. Ethan exhaled slowly, then spoke with a calmness that carried more weight than urgency. "I want all executive access logs from the past 7 days pulled immediately," he said. "And I want physical entry records cross-referenced with each authorization event." The security team responded at once, the corridor filling again with controlled motion as systems were expanded and queries executed. Ava looked up at Ethan for a brief moment, her expression unchanged, but her presence now felt less like an observer and more like a catalyst for everything that had been uncovered. The central screen refreshed, preparing to display the final correlation output, and as the data began to align into a complete sequence, the atmosphere shifted again, not through noise or confrontation, but through the undeniable convergence of evidence that no longer allowed ambiguity to remain in place. The service corridor had reached a level of stillness that felt unnatural, as if every sound in the Grand Sterling Ballroom had been absorbed into the data stream now displayed across the central terminal. Ethan Caldwell stood at the center of that silence, his eyes fixed on the final correlation map that had just completed its reconstruction across multiple executive and operational systems. Ava Johnson remained at his side, no longer pointing or explaining, because the system itself was now speaking in a language that required no interpretation. Every access event, every financial authorization, and every physical entry point had converged into a single timeline that left no gaps for ambiguity. Behind them, the security team had stopped typing for a brief moment, watching as the system highlighted one continuous chain of authority that connected executive override access directly to the evening's service deviation. Victoria Blake stood slightly apart, her posture unchanged, but her attention now locked onto the screen with an intensity that had replaced all earlier composure. Ethan did not speak immediately. He simply observed as the system resolved the final link, drawing a direct connection between executive approval credentials and the same time window in which the catering route had been altered. The display stabilized, and a single identifier appeared at the center of the screen, marking the origin point of the authorization sequence. A senior analyst stepped forward carefully, his voice controlled but lower than before. "The final cross-reference confirms a single executive-level account as the initiating source of the override chain," he said. The words settled heavily into the corridor, not as accusation, but as confirmation of structure. Ethan's gaze remained on the identifier, his expression unreadable, but no longer searching for alternative explanations. Ava stood quietly, her hands now relaxed at her sides, as if the resolution of the system had aligned completely with what she had observed from the beginning. Victoria finally moved, not forward, but slightly backward, a subtle adjustment that placed distance between herself and the center of the screen. Ethan exhaled slowly, then spoke in a calm voice that carried through the corridor without effort. "Verify physical presence logs for the time of authorization," he said. The security team immediately initiated the final check, pulling biometric entries and corridor movement data into a unified display. Within moments, the system highlighted overlapping presence markers that aligned precisely with the executive authorization window. The convergence was no longer theoretical, it was structural, mapped across time, access, and physical location. Ava glanced up at Ethan briefly, then back at the screen, her expression steady, as if the final shape of the truth had simply confirmed what she already understood through observation. One of the analysts cleared his throat before speaking, choosing his words carefully. "The correlation confirms physical proximity to the authorization terminal during the override event," he said. Ethan did not react immediately. Instead, he studied the sequence again, allowing the system to replay the exact moment of authorization entry. The repetition removed any remaining uncertainty. The corridor lights hummed softly overhead, and even the distant sound of the gala above felt disconnected from the precision unfolding below. Victoria remained silent now, her gaze fixed on the far edge of the terminal, no longer engaging with the data directly. Ethan finally lowered his eyes slightly, then spoke with controlled clarity. "Lock this sequence," he said. "No further modifications. I want full audit retention across all executive and operational layers." The command was executed immediately, and the system confirmed permanent record status across all logs. Ava stood still beside him, no longer needing to speak, because the truth had already been fully constructed in digital form. And in that moment, with every layer of access, movement, and authorization aligned into a single uninterrupted chain, the evening reached a point where interpretation was no longer required, only acknowledgement of what the system had already proven without hesitation. The service corridor had entered a state of complete procedural stillness, as if the entire Grand Sterling system had paused its normal rhythm to accommodate the weight of what had just been confirmed. Ethan Caldwell stood at the center of the terminal display, his eyes fixed on the finalized audit chain that now spanned executive authorization, physical presence verification, and financial routing integrity. Every layer of the investigation had collapsed into a single uninterrupted sequence that could no longer be interpreted in multiple ways. Ava Johnson remained beside him, calm and observant, her small presence unchanged despite the complexity unfolding across the screen. She was no longer offering explanations, because the system itself had already translated her earlier observations into verified structural evidence. Behind them, the security team maintained a quiet formation, waiting for the next instruction while the terminal locked the audit record into permanent archival status. Victoria Blake stood further back than before, her posture still controlled, but her attention no longer engaged with the group in the same way. The screen now reflected a level of detail that removed all ambiguity from the situation, and the corridor lighting seemed colder as the system highlighted the final executive identity tied to the authorization chain. A senior analyst stepped forward with caution, his voice steady but noticeably restrained. "The audit confirmation is complete," he said. "The executive authorization origin has been verified and cannot be altered or overridden at this stage." The statement did not introduce new information, but it solidified what the system had already made clear. Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he studied the final sequence one more time, allowing the full structure of the data to settle in his mind without interruption. The access logs, financial overrides, and physical presence markers now formed a continuous timeline with no gaps or inconsistencies. Ava shifted her gaze slightly toward him, then back to the screen, as if confirming that the resolution matched her earlier certainty. The corridor remained silent except for the faint hum of the terminal processors maintaining the locked audit state. Ethan finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Initiate full executive compliance review across all linked accounts," he said. The security team immediately began executing the command, expanding the audit scope to include all related systems tied to the authorization chain. Victoria's expression changed subtly, not through words, but through a controlled adjustment in her stance, as if recalculating her position within the unfolding structure. Ethan turned slightly toward the analyst. "I want every related transaction flagged and preserved in its original state," he added. "No filtering, no summarization." The analyst confirmed the instruction, and the system responded by extending the audit visibility across all executive financial activity connected to the event timeline. Ava remained still, her attention steady, her presence quietly anchoring the moment without disruption. The data on the screen updated once more, now showing a complete map of authorization flow from initiation to execution, including timestamps, access points, and approval layers. Ethan observed the final configuration without interruption, his focus no longer searching for inconsistencies, but verifying completion. A few steps behind, Victoria looked briefly toward the corridor exit again, then returned her gaze to the terminal, where the system had now fully stabilized the record. One of the security officers spoke softly, almost as an acknowledgement of finality. "The audit trail is now fully immutable," he said. Ethan nodded slightly, absorbing the confirmation. The corridor, once filled with uncertainty and fragmented interpretation, now reflected a single consolidated reality defined entirely by verified system behavior. Ava stood beside him, no longer needing to interpret anything further, as every detail she had identified had been translated into confirmed structure. And in that final moment of procedural completion, the environment shifted from investigation into resolution, where every system, every log, and every presence marker aligned into a single undeniable record that closed the evening's uncertainty without requiring any further explanation. The grand Sterling ballroom had fallen into a controlled silence, the kind that follows after a system has fully resolved uncertainty, but before human emotion has caught up with the implications. Ethan Caldwell stood near the central corridor terminal, his attention still anchored to the immutable audit record now sealed across all executive and operational layers. The data no longer shifted, no longer updated, no longer offered interpretation. It existed in a finalized state that demanded acknowledgement rather than analysis. Ava Johnson stood beside him, her posture relaxed compared to earlier, her small hands resting quietly at her sides as she observed Ethan rather than the screen. She was no longer pointing out details or identifying patterns, because everything she had noticed had already been confirmed by the system itself. Behind them, the security team had begun transitioning from investigation posture to administrative closure, carefully documenting final procedures and ensuring all compliance logs were secured for executive review. Victoria Blake remained further back in the corridor, her presence composed but noticeably quieter than before, as if the structure of the evening had shifted beyond the boundaries of influence or correction. The terminal displayed a final confirmation layer, indicating that all executive authorization trails had been locked and preserved under full audit retention protocol. A senior compliance officer stepped forward, his tone formal but subdued. "All investigative parameters have been completed," he said. "The system has finalized the integrity report across all linked authorization pathways." Ethan did not immediately respond. He continued to look at the screen for a moment longer, as if ensuring that the absence of change itself was the final answer. Then he slowly turned his attention toward Ava. There was no urgency in his movement, only recognition. "You were correct from the beginning," he said quietly. Ava did not react with surprise or pride. She simply nodded once, as though confirming something she had already accepted internally long before the system validated it. The corridor lighting remained steady, casting a neutral tone across the now stabilized environment. Victoria finally took a small step forward, her voice controlled but noticeably restrained. "Ethan," she said carefully, "this situation has escalated far beyond a simple procedural review. I hope you understand how this will appear once it reaches public channels." Ethan turned slightly toward her, his expression no longer shaped by uncertainty or analysis, but by clarity formed through verification. "What matters is not appearance," he said. "What matters is what the system has confirmed without contradiction." The words were not raised, yet they carried enough weight to settle the space again into silence. A few members of the security team exchanged brief glances, recognizing that their role in the process had shifted from investigation to documentation of final state. Ava looked up briefly toward Ethan, then toward the corridor exit where distant sounds of the gala still echoed faintly, unchanged and unaware of the structural resolution that had just occurred beneath it. Ethan gestured slightly toward the terminal. "Archive the full record under executive integrity classification," he instructed, "and restrict modification access permanently." The compliance officer confirmed the instruction and initiated final sealing protocols across all connected systems. The screen displayed one last confirmation sequence as the audit trail transitioned into permanent preservation mode. Victoria remained still, her gaze no longer focused on the data, but on the completed structure of the situation itself, as if measuring what remained once control had been removed from the equation. Ethan exhaled slowly, then stepped back from the terminal, no longer studying it as a source of answers, but acknowledging it as a closed system. Ava remained beside him, quiet and steady, her presence unchanged as the environment around her settled into resolution. The corridor, once filled with layered uncertainty and overlapping interpretations, now existed in a state of final clarity, where every action had been recorded, every access verified, and every assumption replaced by confirmed structure. And in that final state, the evening no longer moved forward, but simply stood complete, held in place by the certainty of what had already been proven beyond revision.